At first light on October 23, 1942, the desert around El Alamein slowly brightened as Italian tank crews in the Ariete Armored Division made their final checks. Packed inside the narrow interiors of their M13-40 medium tanks, they counted ammunition and inspected weapons, just over 147mm shells per vehicle, and 4 machine guns ready to fire. Behind the front line, hundreds of engines roared to life as nearly 300 Italian tanks prepared to move into what would become one of the largest armored clashes ever fought in North Africa. Few of these crews realized that within hours they would encounter an opponent whose equipment would challenge everything they believed about their own machines. The arrival of newer American-built tanks on the battlefield exposed the growing technological gap between Italy's armored forces and those of the Allies. What unfolded was more than a tactical setback. It became a stark demonstration of industrial capacity and modern warfare, forcing many Italian soldiers to reassess both their equipment and the confidence they had been encouraged to maintain. The roots of this moment stretched back to 1937, when designers at Fiat Ansaldo began work on a new medium tank for the Royal Italian Army. The goal was to replace outdated tankettes and the problematic M1139 with a more capable vehicle. The resulting design, later designated the M13/40, took its name from its planned 13-ton weight and its intended service entry around 1940. On paper, the tank appeared competitive of Italian armored vehicles during the war. Italian commanders initially viewed the new tank as a step into modern armored combat. Against earlier British vehicles, its gun and armor could be effective at typical engagement distances, yet training and organization lagged behind the hardware. Crews often received only a few weeks of instruction before deployment. Many units lacked radios, and coordination on the battlefield suffered as a result. The first major tests came in North Africa in late 1940. During the British offensive known as Operation Compass, Italian formations equipped with the new tanks were quickly thrown into combat. At the Battle of Bardia in early January 1941, Australian forces attacked positions defended in part by M1340 units. After several days of fighting, Allied casualties numbered in the hundreds, but Italian losses were far greater, with tens of thousands killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. These early defeats signaled a deeper problem. Armored warfare was advancing rapidly, and the pace of innovation favored nations with greater industrial resources and more extensive training systems. By the time of the desert battles in 1942, many Italian crews would confront the reality that their vehicles, once seen as modern, were already being overtaken by faster, better armed, and more heavily protected tanks on the battlefield. Italian tank crews who escaped the fighting at Bardia later described the chaos they experienced. Most of their vehicles lacked radios, making coordinated action nearly impossible. When British guns began shelling their positions, individual tanks reacted on their own, often too late. Many were knocked out before they even fired a shot. The tank itself was not entirely to blame. At the beginning of 1941, the M1340's main gun was capable of defeating most British cruiser tanks at standard combat distances, and its armor protection was roughly on par with vehicles such as the Crusader. The design was not exceptional, but it was serviceable for its era. The real shortcomings lay elsewhere: insufficient training, weak doctrine, and limited logistical support. Italian crews received little preparation in coordinated combined arms warfare. There were almost no recovery vehicles, so damaged tanks were frequently left behind. Harsh desert conditions overwhelmed mechanics who lacked proper training, and supply routes stretched across vast coastal distances, straining resources. By April 1941, as German forces of the Afrika Korps arrived in strength, Italian units still fielded around 240 M13 and M14 tanks at the front. The earlier setbacks had forced changes. Training programs expanded, new instruction centers were established in Italy, and crews gradually improved their skills. Radios became standard equipment, and cooperation with German formations increased. Italian tankers began to demonstrate that, under better conditions, they could fight effectively. This progress was evident at the First Battle of Bir el Gubi on November 19, 1941. Tanks from the Ariete Division engaged British armored units in a day-long clash. The fighting showed that better-trained Italian crews could stand up to Crusader tanks armed with 40mm guns. Both sides possessed weapons capable of destroying the other, and both had notable weaknesses. Certain situations during the Gazala battles in May and June 1942. On June 12, tanks from the Trieste Motorized Division clashed with British Grant tanks south of Knightsbridge. Several Allied vehicles were destroyed as Italian crews maneuvered aggressively, closing in to fire at vulnerable tracks and side armor. These engagements demonstrated growing competence and determination among Italian tankers. Despite these improvements, technological disparities became more pronounced. In early 1942, British forces began fielding large numbers of American-built M3 Grant tanks. Equipped with a 75mm hull-mounted gun and a 37mm turret gun, the Grant could engage targets at ranges beyond the reach of the Italian 47mm weapon. Its firepower could penetrate Italian armor from distances where the M1340 struggled to respond effectively. As the months passed, the M1340's design limitations became increasingly evident. Its riveted construction posed a serious danger. Even when enemy shells failed to penetrate, the impact could shear off rivets that then ricocheted inside the crew compartment. Bolted armor plates were also prone to cracking under stress. The two-man turret forced the commander to act simultaneously as gunner and leader, slowing decision-making in combat. Although the engine was dependable, it lacked sufficient power for the tank's weight. An issue worsened when crews added sandbags or spare track links for extra protection. Tank crews were aware of these flaws and tried to compensate by reinforcing vulnerable areas with improvised armor. Commanders were well aware that their armored units lacked sufficient firepower. From 1942 onward, every Italian tank battalion typically received at least one company equipped with Semovente 75-18 self-propelled guns. These turretless machines used the M1340 chassis and mounted a 75mm howitzer capable of firing shaped-charge anti-tank rounds that could pierce Allied armor. They became an important source of support on the battlefield and helped compensate for the shortcomings of Italy's medium tanks. Still, the Semovente vehicles were not true tanks. They were not suited for maneuver warfare against enemy armor, and their numbers were always too limited to make a decisive difference. By October 1942, the focus shifted to the Second Battle of El Alamein. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery had spent months preparing the British Eighth Army for a major offensive. 3 armored divisions, among them the famous Desert Rats, were ready to break through Axis defenses. Roughly 1,000 British tanks were assembled, including Crusader Mark III vehicles armed with 6-pounder guns and heavily armored Churchill infantry tanks. The British also fielded something Italian crews had only heard about, the American M4 Sherman. About 250 Shermans were available, with a portion operational at the opening of the offensive and distributed across several British armored brigades. This marked the Shermans' first combat use in North Africa. Facing them was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, composed of German and Italian formations, with about 540 tanks in total. Night of October 23rd, Allied artillery began a massive bombardment. Around 900 guns fired for hours, sending high explosive and shrapnel across the desert in an attempt to shatter defenses and morale. Before dawn, the shelling stopped and infantry units moved forward through the minefields, while engineers cleared safe lanes for the tanks that would follow. On the second day, armored formations advanced. Italian crews spotted them through periscopes as shapes emerging through dust and smoke. Range estimates and target calls followed drilled procedures, and guns were brought to bear on the approaching armor. Then the crews saw their first Shermans clearly. The vehicles appeared larger and taller than expected, with angled armor surfaces designed to deflect incoming rounds. Even from over a kilometer away, the long 75mm gun barrel was visible, clearly more powerful than the Italian weapon. The Sherman advanced steadily and deliberately, suggesting confidence rather than urgency. Technically, the contrast was stark. The Italian M1340 weighed about 14 tons, the Sherman more than double at roughly 31. Italian armor thickness ranged from 30 to 42 millimeters, while the Sherman had 51 to 64 millimeters on the front hull, sloped for improved protection, and 76 millimeters on the turret front. Italian guns could theoretically penetrate around 88 millimeters of armor at very close range under ideal conditions, but sloped armor greatly reduced effectiveness. The 5-man crew layout allowed the commander to focus solely on directing the fight, and radio communication and optics were superior. Suspension performance over rough terrain was better, and ammunition stowage offered improved protection. In nearly every measurable respect, aside from fuel consumption, the Sherman held the advantage. Initial encounters were brief for many Italian crews. Tanks positioned in ambush, hoping to surprise advancing Allied armor, found that Sherman units did not rush blindly forward. Instead, British and American crews often halted at around 1,500 meters, beyond the effective range of Italian guns, and opened fire with well-trained precision. Using superior optics and disciplined target selection, they engaged methodically, destroying Italian tanks before those crews could respond effectively. Sherman tanks pierced Italian armor on both turrets and hulls, often igniting ammunition and causing catastrophic explosions. In many cases, even when shells failed to fully penetrate, the riveted construction of Italian tanks created lethal hazards. Impacting rivets could break free, turning into deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment, wounding or killing the personnel, despite the armor remaining intact. Italian tank commanders frequently ordered reversals to seek safer positions, but the Sherman's superior range, mobility, and armor allowed their crews to control the engagement distance. This dynamic played out repeatedly across the North African battlefields. Italian crews displayed remarkable bravery, attempting to close in where their guns might inflict damage, but Sherman units consistently maintained distance, utilized hull-down positions, and coordinated closely with supporting infantry and artillery. and hardened steel plates deflected shells that would have destroyed Italian M13/40 tanks. Italian tankers were forced to focus on disabling tracks to immobilize Shermans, hoping that anti-tank infantry or German armored units could then finish the job. Engagements became primarily exercises in survival rather than outright combat. Crews learned to evade, conceal, and hope they avoided direct Sherman fire. The Second Battle of El Alamein lasted 13 days, from October 23 to November 11. Montgomery's forces broke through Axis lines in the northern sector, triggering a general withdrawal. The Italian Ariete and Littorio armored divisions fought desperate rearguard actions, sacrificing themselves to cover the German retreat. Countless Italian tanks burned in the desert, abandoned or destroyed to slow the enemy's advance. By the battle's conclusion, Axis armored forces were virtually annihilated. Of the 278 Italian medium tanks that began the fight, fewer than 30 survived, many disabled and left behind during the retreat. The withdrawal from Egypt marked a decisive turning point for Italian armor in North Africa. As the front moved west, Italian tank crews faced not only Sherman tanks, but also British Grants, upgraded Crusaders with 6-pounder guns, and an increasing number of American armored units. By early 1943, Italian forces in Tunisia, including the Centauro Division, were severely depleted. Their remaining M13 and M14 tanks were technologically obsolete. Their main guns could not threaten Allied medium tanks except at extremely close range. The captured tank crews experienced a mixture of relief at surviving and shame at Italy's collapse. Aware that their sacrifices had achieved little against superior enemy equipment. Prisoners sent to the United States observed the scale of American industrial output firsthand during the 2-week transatlantic journey on Liberty ships. The SS Robert E. Peary, for example, had been launched in just over 4 days at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, with typical construction times averaging 1 to 1.5 months by 1943. The sheer volume of American production was staggering. Multiple shipyards were completing ships at nearly 3 per day at peak capacity. Italian captives were immediately struck by the abundance aboard these vessels. American sailors enjoyed regular meals including fresh meat, milk, vegetables, and bread, discarding leftovers without concern. Observing such waste, portions that would have sustained Italian families for weeks, underscored the contrast in material conditions. When the ships reached Norfolk, Virginia, in August 1943, prisoners saw sprawling naval bases where dozens of vessels were loaded and unloaded simultaneously, highlighting the industrial might that had made the Allies' battlefield dominance almost inevitable. Electric cranes handled cargo that, back in Italy, would have required entire teams of dockworkers. The port remained active day and night, illuminated by countless electric lights. Italians who had previously worked in factories were struck by the scale of operations, noting in letters home that each crane could move in an hour what an Italian laborer might manage in a full day. Everything was powered by electricity, fully mechanized, and astonishingly efficient. And Oklahoma. Along the route, Italian prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, witnessing a reality that contradicted every piece of fascist propaganda. Small towns glowed with electric lights, store windows displayed goods, and homes were brightly lit. Factories operated night shifts, and parking lots were packed with workers' cars, a sight unimaginable in Italy, where car ownership was largely a luxury for the wealthy. Here, ordinary employees drove to their jobs. Italian officers who had traveled through Germany wrote letters that bypassed Allied censorship, describing American towns where lighting outshone that of Rome, and factories dwarfed anything they had seen in Milan or Turin. Midnight sightings of parking lots filled with cars belonging to night shift workers confirmed a reality they could hardly grasp. In the United States, even laborers owned automobiles. Passing industrial zones, the trains revealed America's vast manufacturing capacity. Near Louisville, prisoners glimpsed the synthetic rubber plants, massive complexes employing thousands and producing hundreds of thousands of tons annually, far exceeding what Italy and Germany could produce combined. Approaching Detroit, the train slowed near Ford's Willow Run plant, where B-24 Liberator bombers were assembled. Built in under a year, this single facility produced one bomber every hour at its peak, with 42,000 employees assembling aircraft from over 1 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. Its immense scale was visible for miles. Its hospital contained X-ray machines, surgical tools, and pharmaceutical supplies that exceeded those available in many Italian civilian hospitals. Daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, foodstuffs that Italian civilians had not seen since before the war. Prisoners assigned to kitchen work found electric mixers, gas ranges, and walk-in refrigerators capable of feeding thousands. A 10% surplus was prepared to ensure full rations, with excess discarded each day. Experienced Italian chefs wrote to their families in disbelief. More food was wasted daily in the camp than entire villages had seen in months, yet it was all fresh and edible. By late 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture meant Italian prisoners were employed on farms and in factories under the Geneva Convention. Though prohibited from directly contributing to war production, their work freed American laborers for military service. Former tankers found themselves harvesting vast wheat fields in Nebraska using combines that replaced hundreds of manual workers, achieving yields double those in Italy. In Texas, electric-powered cotton gins processed in an hour what Italian communities could manage in an entire month. These modern facilities were the result of rural electrification, granting ordinary farmers electricity, trucks, tractors, and running water. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed automated lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than Italian factories could in a month. Shortages in North Africa. Italian prisoners held in the United States during World War II witnessed a reality that starkly contradicted the propaganda they had been taught at home. By late 1943 and into 1944, it became clear to them that American industrial output was unmatched. Factories produced resources on a scale that made shortages nearly impossible, undermining the long-held belief that democracies were inherently weak compared to fascist systems. Educational programs were offered at the camps, with Italian officers attending lectures and correspondence courses organized by American universities. These sessions covered topics like economics, governance, and democracy. Unlike crude wartime propaganda, the lessons were grounded in observable facts. Officers reported back to their families, noting that they had been told democracies could not compete with Axis powers due to prioritizing profit over national service. Yet in practice, private American industry manufactured more tanks than the combined Axis nations. Similarly, claims that military efficiency required worker exploitation were disproven. Well-paid American laborers, allowed to organize unions, produced superior weapons faster than controlled Italian workers. Each expectation instilled by fascist ideology collapsed under direct observation. The D-Day landings in June 1944 provided another powerful example. Guards and camp personnel made clear that the fight was against fascist leaders, not the Italian people. News of family deaths or illnesses was often personally delivered by American officers, while church groups facilitated medical aid to families in Italy. These repeated acts of care challenged the prisoners' preconceptions of their supposed enemies. Medical treatment in particular left a lasting impression. Tank crews captured after severe injuries received advanced care, including penicillin, in American hospitals, care often superior to what they would have experienced in Italy or Germany. Italian medical officers assisting in camp hospitals later confirmed they could administer cutting-edge treatments to prisoners without hesitation, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost. Following Italy's armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, approximately 90% of Italian prisoners, about 45,000 men, agreed to cooperate with the Allied effort. These individuals joined Italian service units, gaining better accommodations, American uniforms, expanded freedoms, and the opportunity to engage with Italian-American communities. They served in ports, depots, and support roles, freeing American troops for combat operations. The remaining 10%, who remained loyal to the fascist cause, was segregated into camps such as Camp Hereford and received treatment consistent with Geneva Convention standards. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, the prospect of returning home stirred complex emotions. Observed a society that functioned efficiently, generated plenty, and demonstrated that democracy could operate successfully. In the final months before their release, American authorities focused on preparing them for reintegration into civilian life. The prisoners received vocational training, agricultural instruction, and lessons on democratic governance. They studied economics, constitutional rights, and the responsibilities of citizens in a functioning democracy. The goal was not merely to return them as former combatants, but to equip them to become informed participants in a democratic Italy. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of Italians returned home. They encountered a nation in ruins, bombed-out cities, shattered infrastructure, and an economy on the brink of collapse. The fascist regime that had sent them to war had fallen, replaced by fragile democratic institutions. Yet these returning soldiers brought back a unique resource: first-hand experience of a productive, free, and democratic industrial society. They had witnessed how efficiency could coexist with liberty, how wealth could grow without military conquest, and how true strength stemmed from freedom rather than coercion. The rapid economic growth of Italy in the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called Italian economic miracle, was partly rooted in the knowledge these former prisoners had gained in the US, combined with Marshall Plan assistance. They applied American industrial techniques, adopted agricultural innovations learned abroad, and supported democratic institutions, having seen them succeed. The contrast between Italian and American armored vehicles illustrates a broader lesson about industrial capacity. The Italian M1340 tank weighed 14 tons, carried 30 to 42 millimeters of armor, and was armed with a 47 millimeter gun. The American Sherman tank, by comparison, weighed 31 tons, had sloped frontal armor of 51 to 64 mm and a 76 mm turret gun, and its engine produced 400 horsepower versus the M13's 125. While both guns could penetrate roughly 73 to 88 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters, the Sherman's sloped armor effectively increased its protective value. More crucially, the disparity lay in production capacity. Italy manufactured around 3,000 M13/40s and variants during the entire war, rarely exceeding 70 per month, each requiring skilled labor. The U.S., in contrast, produced over 49,000 Shermans between 1942 and 1946, with peak output exceeding 2,000 per month from a single factory, more than Italy's annual production. This pattern repeated across aircraft, artillery, trucks, and ammunition. American industry could replace losses far faster than Italy could, sustaining a prolonged global conflict. Italian tank crews confronting Shermans at El Alamein were not defeated due solely to inferior tactics or bravery. Their failure reflected the structural limitations of Italy's industrial system. Fought under fascist ideals, convinced of their own strength, only to confront the industrial power and operational efficiency of the Allied forces. The encounter revealed a system capable of producing vast quantities of advanced equipment and sustaining armies through freedom-driven innovation rather than rigid control. Many who survived captivity returned to Italy with a renewed commitment to democracy, contributing to the establishment of a nation that would grow into one of America's closest allies. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci of the Ariete Division illustrated the valor of Italian tank crews under extreme conditions. During the Second Battle of El Alamein on November 4–5, 1942, he led 11 M13/40 tanks in a desperate counterattack against the British 8th Armored Brigade, enabling the rest of the division to withdraw. Pascucci was killed in the engagement but was posthumously awarded Italy's highest military distinction, the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare. Today, the Italian Army's 13th Tank Battalion bears his name, M.O. Pascucci, commemorating his sacrifice. General Francesco Antonio Arena commanded the Ariete Division in its final engagement at El Alamein. Surrounded and facing overwhelming opposition, Arena sent a final dispatch summarizing both the dire circumstances and the resilience of his troops. Despite being outmatched, the division fought tenaciously, earning Italy's Gold Medal of Military Valor for actions across Tobruk, Benghazi, Gubi, Gazala, Alam el-Halfa, and El Alamein. The Folgore Paratrooper Division similarly faced overwhelming odds, sending 5,000 men into the battle, with only 304 surviving to expend their final rounds. Across these engagements, Italian tank crews confronted the stark reality of industrialized warfare. Their M13/40 tanks were no match for Sherman tanks. Captured soldiers witnessed firsthand the advantages of an economy capable of mass-producing superior equipment and sustaining prolonged conflict. The experience had lasting consequences. Soldiers who had entered the desert loyal to fascism returned home transformed, inspired by the democratic and economic systems of the United States. These lessons informed post-war reconstruction, helping Italy evolve into a democratic republic aligned with the nation that had defeated it on the battlefield. The superiority of the Sherman over the M13/40 was not merely a matter of engineering skill. It reflected the broader capacity of a society that encouraged innovation, mass production, and individual initiative. Today, M1340 tanks are museum artifacts, relics of a system that ultimately failed. Shermans, while also retired, symbolize the industrial and democratic strength that shaped victory. Yet the enduring legacy lies not in the machines themselves, but in the men who operated them, soldiers who witnessed defeat, survived captivity, absorbed vital lessons, and returned home to help forge a free and prosperous Italy.